It's been a while, but welcome back to The Crusty Fox. We're on to Season 1, Episode 2 of Sex and the City. This one's titled Models and Mortals, because not content with ragging on men alone, Carrie's decided 2 episodes in that women also deserve a turn in her crosshairs. We begin with Miranda on a nearly blind date with excitable man-child Nick, who takes her to a friend's dinner party as his +1. He asks them all to name which celebrity, living or dead, they'd do the nasty with. Presumably he means getting with the dead ones when they were alive, but considering the extremely low bar this show sets for its men, who knows? Miranda's answer is Sean Connery. Yikes. Later, in the kitchen, some of Nick's supposed friends let Miranda in on a little secret. The only reason she got an invite was because Nick usually shows up with a model in tow. Sick of one-sided conversations, they ordered Nick to show up with someone capable of forming a sentence that doesn't involve the sound "oh." They clearly didn't think it all the way through, since without a model to make fun of all night, they have to get their kicks by negging the fuck out of Miranda's less runway-ready appearance instead. We, the viewers, simultaneously discover that Nick has been attending identical dinner parties with those models for some time, posing the exact same sex question again and again like a horny speaking spell someone's jammed a screwdriver into. By the time she and Nick are in a cab home, Mount Miranda is ready to blow. She confronts him, forcing him to admit his model fixation. In an attempt to smooth things over, Nick reminds Miranda that she had a nice evening, right up until his friends implied that she was an above-average orc. Significantly underestimating the amount of danger he's in, he assumes that this has earned him enough brownie points to go in for a kiss. We're not shown what happens next, but my guess is that Miranda paid the driver another $100 to dispose of Nick somewhere along the New Jersey Turnpike. Catching up on all the details so that she actually has something to put into her column this week, Carrie terms Nick and his ilk modelizers. Surprisingly, it's a real term, and describes the kind of man who thinks his penis gains an inch every time someone sees him out on the town with a beautiful woman. Carrie spins what she thinks is a fantastic original metaphor about Manhattan being a safari, where modelizers come to seek their prey. In an early sign of the sour grapes to come, she writes off all models as shallow, materialistic jungle animals. At another of the 4 ladies eating for a small village but never gaining weight hangouts, Miranda makes the first of her many calls for men to be shot on sight. I'd advise against turning this into a drinking game because you will 100% die long before any given season is over. You might not even live to see the end of certain episodes. Samantha, hilariously, announces that many men have told her she looks like a model, and that must mean she is one. It's at times like this that you'd be forgiven for wondering if Samantha secretly hates a lot of them and is purely there to give them a shove whenever their self-esteem is on a cliff edge. Carrie tells us in standard narcissistic voiceover that bringing up this topic is a good way to spice up a dull night. So not only is she also trolling her friends, but finds them boring. Nobody should be friends with Carrie. Because even an overly critical stopped clock is right twice a day, Carrie eventually stumbles upon a good point about the futility of beauty standards. But that glimmer of sense flickers out as quickly as you might expect. All except Samantha, obviously, name things about their bodies that make them feel self-conscious. These mostly imagined imperfections are somehow the fault of the models, who the 4 of them assume, in a stunning display of ignorant jealousy, don't think of themselves the same way. Carrie takes it upon herself to ponder the question, how powerful is beauty? Very, Carrie. It's very powerful. You just discussed how powerful it was with those 3 friends you barely tolerate because their love lives are the source of your inexplicably steady income. The less said about this episode's main talking heads section, the better. Just like the last episode, the women proclaim their superiority over men, in this case seducing them into opening their wallets, and the men downplay the importance of a woman's intelligence while generously acknowledging that it exists. FYI, one of the models interviewed is called Zandrella, with an X. If you've ever met a Zandrella in real life, I'd love to hear from you so that you can tell me all about the fairy tale kingdom you escaped from. Carrie actually does some journalistic work next, to the surprise of everyone, and going off her snooty attitude, nobody more so than herself. She interviews a man ironically named Barkley because he wastes no time in comparing models to dogs. Carrie pretends to disapprove, as if she hadn't just referred to them as beasts of the rainforest herself. You might think that some offensive misogyny was the worst Barkley would have to offer, but this is Sex and the City, my friends. He one-ups himself by showing Carrie a wall of TVs which contain what he calls his art. Videos of himself making the beast with 2 backs with numerous models. As if that isn't bad enough, it's fairly clear that the women didn't consent to being filmed and almost certainly don't know the tapes exist. Or, for that matter, are being casually shown to nosy, judgmental journalists. You'd expect Carrie to be outraged, right? Smash the TV sets, storm out, call the police? Nah, of course she doesn't. What Carrie can't believe about the situation is how many models Barclay's managed to lure into his candid camera boudoir. She lights a cigarette and seems disturbingly turned on by what she's discovered. Because the only woman Carrie ever really shows up for is Carrie. To cleanse herself of those sexual thoughts, Carrie meets up with her rent-a-loser friend Skipper Johnston, who looks like a 6-foot-tall flaccid penis that went shopping at a thrift store. Skipper is now obsessed with Miranda, having had one appalling date with her in the previous episode. That nightmare scenario ended in a no-means-yes kiss, which, if she's a Bond fan, probably explains her Sean Connery crush. Miranda's successful ghosting of Skipper ever since now has him doubting his romantic prowess. Carrie seems to have learned the wrong lesson from Miranda's negging experience, because when she half-heartedly tries to reassure Skipper by telling him that he's adorable, you know it's a read. He then whips out one of the house bricks that used to pass for phones in the 90s and tells Carrie to call Miranda back for him, like she's going to be able to psychically tell it isn't him on the other end this time. When he's predictably screened again, he grabs the phone back and unleashes one of the most embarrassingly inept attempts at coercion I've ever seen. If Charlotte considers herself the show's optimistic Disney princess, then Skipper is its incel prince. If someone told him there was a cursed unconscious woman in the woods he had unsupervised access to, he'd break the sound barrier getting there. Carrie smugly looks into the camera and declares that there's a curse on the head of anyone who tries to fix up their friends. This is our first example of Carrie managing the impressive feat of gaslighting herself, since her self-confessed reason for pairing them up just one episode ago was because she knew Miranda would hate Skipper. Because the only person Carrie truly does favours for is Carrie. Bored and in need of more people to judge, Carrie attends a fashion show with her good, terrible friend Stanford Blur. Because it's literally all the show ever gives him to do, Stanford is ogling a male model he refers to as The Bone, an underwear model so named for his impressive credentials between me down there. The Bone, whose gifted nethers must be the universe's way of apologising for making his real name Derek, committed some kind of unspeakably horrific crime in a past life and so now has to be Stanford's client. Exactly what Stanford's job entails beyond pestering his clients sexually and touching them without asking remains unclear for the rest of the series. And in case you think I direct too many accusations at Carrie, Stanford goes for gold here in the problematic Olympics when he claims that nobody with model good looks could possibly be straight. Ergo, in Stanford's eyes, all gay men are beautiful. He fails to account for himself in this, of course, because Stanford, on a good day, looks like a mole that tunneled into an apprentice designer's offcuts bin. Samantha's already sitting right by the runway, of course, because it's an underwear show, and she can detect when a man's junk is behind one layer of fabric or less, like a beagle at the airport can sniff out a slab of devil's dandruff. And yes, I just made a dog comparison. I'm no better than Barclay. Speaking of, Barclay arrives, presumably in need of a place to hide until his arrest warrant expires. After establishing that he isn't gay, Samantha chooses to take Carrie's sudden disapproval of him as a challenge, one which, naturally, she eagerly accepts. Later, at a random party, of which 90s New York seemingly had an endless supply, Carrie stops cramming mini pastries into the void where all her calories go long enough to run into Mr. Big again. Carrie describes Big as out of her league based on his successful career and attractiveness. Set your timers because this self-deprecation lasts all of 60 seconds. Big admits to Carrie that he started reading her column after their brief, weird meeting in the previous episode. He describes it as cute. It's clear that to Carrie, he might as well have popped a squat on the newspaper right in front of her. After briefly dissing modelizers, Carrie realizes that she's chatting with the enemy, when Big reveals that he brought one of the show's models as his date. She speculates, bitterly, that some modelizers are only in it for the validation. Then she lets slip the real reason she's writing her article. She's condemning modelizers to counteract her own feelings of inferiority next to the kind of women they're interested in. I'm not sure what she'd like models to do about their genetically predisposed attractiveness, though this is Carrie we're talking about, so she'd probably consider things even if they let her use their faces as an ashtray. The writers of the show then take a turn shooting themselves in the foot. Carrie muses to herself about how she left her vanity behind at 30 when she realised that she could no longer be bothered with the superficial. In all likelihood, this was exactly who the writers intended her to be at first. Self-involved, but also unassuming, and not overly concerned with her appearance. Later in the series, when they realised that Carrie was becoming a style icon, that tune quickly changed. Suddenly she's whining endlessly about shoes and bankrupting herself to overfill a closet that must have the internal dimensions of the TARDIS. Carrie doesn't have the energy to be superficial, like I don't have the energy to read complimentary YouTube comments. Hint hint. Samantha rocks up and asks Carrie whether Barkley might have mistaken her for a model. Carrie wisely dodges the question, like the loaded gun it is, and finally having it contextualised by someone she holds a faint ember of affection for, warns her about the Wall of Conquests. Except what Carrie sees as a red flag, Samantha sees as a green light, and she happily trots back over to Barkley with a new mission in mind. As Carrie leaves, she's stopped by Derek, who has been abandoned by Stanford in favour of an indecent assault on a Versace model. Derek asks to come home with her to escape the crowds, which mentally puts him somewhere between frightened child and unsocialised puppy, but it doesn't put Carrie off. Because, you guessed it, after spending a whole episode moaning about modelizers, Carrie wants to go home with someone pretty to feel better about herself too. Never let your supposedly lofty values get in the way of a quick self-esteem boost. They do go home together, but not for what you might think. Instead, Derek just wants to talk to someone about feeling lonely in the big city. Carrie, meanwhile, suffers a total empathy failure and quietly gloats over the somehow unexpected news that sexy people feel bad sometimes too. They fall asleep in Carrie's bed, Derek taking the opportunity to get a single night's sleep that isn't interrupted by Stanford climbing a fire escape to mush his naked body up against the bedroom window. Because there is no God, we then get to check back in with Miranda and Skipper, who bump into each other at a late night bodega. Miranda's sole purchase is cat food, which you don't need me to make a joke about because it's perfect as it is. Skipper, who increasingly talks to women like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle talks to pizza, questions her elusive behaviour in typically incel fashion. Specifically, he wants to know if she treats all men this way. To remove any doubt, by this way, he means not immediately getting matching genital tattoos after a first date. Probably only just holding back the urge to scream cowabunga, Skipper continues to be the king of right place, right time when he accidentally keys into Miranda's model-damaged self-esteem with a fancy compliment. She responds with less of an invitation and more of an instruction for him to spend the night with her. Like a first-time fisherman confused as to what the pull on his line means, Skipper momentarily weighs whether he'd rather stay and buy breakfast cereal. Samantha, meanwhile, makes it back to Barkley's budget bunga bunga barn and wastes no time in asking for her close-up. It turns out that he doesn't consider her a model after all, but gent that he is, will make an exception for her. This would have been a killing blow to the other three, but Samantha went in there with a mission and she accomplished it, so that's all that matters to her. Like the A-team, Samantha loves it when a plan comes together. Or, for that matter, when a man comes wherever. The next morning, Stanford calls Carrie to find out where his victim-to-be ran off to. Still desperately looking for a way into Derek's already at capacity pants, Stanford's response when told about the events of the night before is to imply that platonic bed sharing is some kind of big gay smoking gun. Truly the absolute worst. Because it must be Stalker Saturday, Big later shows up unannounced at the cafe Carrie told him earlier that she sometimes works from. In a misguided attempt at damage control after ditching her the night before, Big basically confirms Carrie's worst fears when he implies that models offer a good time, but regular-looking people with a passable sense of humour offer a long time. Humble words indeed from the man who probably just bundled that good time into a cab headed for the nearest pharmacy. Somehow his bare minimum effort pays off and Carrie is happy once again to have the vague and slightly insulting attention of a man so slimy that he could hit Mach 3 on a dry slip and slide. And that's all for the second ramble through the dense and thorny underbrush of a 90s New York that didn't actually exist. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and leave a comment to let me know your take. If you'd like to see more of this content, the best way to tell me is by subscribing and turning on notifications so that you know when a new video is out. Either way, thanks for watching, and as ever, if you can't be good, be crusty.